welcome back to Behind the Bastards, the only podcast on the internet that you're currently listening to, unless you're one of those weird people who's like trying to like maximize your intellectual benefit because you listen to too many weird YouTube grifters and you've got a different earbud to a different phone in each ear and you're like double podcasting as you read a book because that's going to get you the most knowledge so that you can probably put a bunch of scam books up on Amazon or get into fucking, I don't know, real estate fraud. God, the internet's a great place. And one of the great things about the internet is the guest we're bringing on today. And as a doctor, obviously, Dr. Kaveh Hoda has made a vow to first do no harm, which is weird because every time we have him on this show, he kills it. Kaveh, welcome to the program.
That was fantastic.
I know. I thought about the one this morning, and I was just waiting to use it.
Goodness, I'm going to steal that. Another day working our fingers to the bone in the podcast minds, good buddy.
That's
I'm
right.
happy to be
That's
back.
right.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. Now, Kaveh, this is a coming during a difficult time. I actually wrote most of this episode in the bone marrow transplant ward and then the ICU that my dad was in as I was doing overnights watching him. And I have a question for you because the hospital I'm at, I'm not going to give the precise name, but I'm in North Texas. The hospital I'm at the bottom floor next to like one of the restaurants has an antique store. And this antique store is so crowded with stuff that you can barely walk in it. And the proprietor and only employee is a man who seems to be in his 80s and wears, at least as far as I can tell, only like 3-piece suits. And is this the devil? Have I found the devil?
Wait. Hold on. Let's back up just a moment because you said there was restaurants and an antique store.
There's an antique store in the hospital. It's next to a subway.
In the hospital. That is
next to a subway, so unhinged.
I know why you'd want a subway in a hospital because you need food at the hospital when you're watching.
Nothing says hospital ambiance like expired lunch meat.
I don't understand. I mean, my California mind cannot comprehend. I've never worked or been in a hospital in which there are more than. I mean, there's a cafeteria, but not anything I would say is close to a restaurant.
Yeah,
it's
they've
certainly
got a couple
nothing
little cafes.
like. Nothing that resembles an antique store. Maybe a gift shop with balloons.
Store.
What?
Yeah.
Why are you going to an antique store in the hospital? What is happening in Texas?
I mentioned this to my doctor brother who practices in Texas, and he was like, oh yeah, and I was like, what do you mean? Oh yeah, he's like,
why?
But why?
Why?
He was not fazed by it, and I was like, this is. I'm like, what is happening there?
Anyway,
and yes, it is the devil.
Yeah, there's no way this is not a needful things kind of situation.
Yeah, exactly
here,
what I
right?
was gonna say. Right. Yeah, don't. There's some weird gin monkey paw thing to anything that person sells.
Yeah.
Don't buy it.
Because I've been talking to the nurses too, and every nurse I ask is like, I have no fucking idea. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense unless they built the hospital on the antique store, and the antique store was like, you cannot change the antique store.
The store was there first. They just had to put a house or a hospital around it.
It's been here forever. Sometimes dead
Some
is
say
better.
it's older than the hills themselves.
Right.
Kaveh.
Yes.
You're a scientist as a doctor.
Yeah.
A kind
I
of
understand.
scientist.
Yeah, sort of. Scientific method is something I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, you utilize science.
Correct. Yeah.
What do you know? How do you feel about forensic science? You know, stuff like fingerprinting, DNA analysis, that kind of jazz.
Well, it is interesting. I feel like there are certain parts of it that are very interesting to me and seem to have, some good evidence behind it, like toxicology, DNA stuff. I think we've gotten fairly good at that. It's like a science, but I don't know. I mean, a lot of it seems to me, and maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm guessing not, because that's what the topic of today's show is. But I feel like just because you label something a science doesn't necessarily mean it's a science, like Scientology, for example. You know what I mean? So I feel like there might be some parts of forensic science that are not. Can I tell you a little bit of a backstory on this one?
Sure, please.
So when I was in medical school, I did my psychiatry rotation in a jail. So I actually did forensic psychiatry, and I sat down with a warden once who considered himself like a world expert. And there were a lot of great people that worked in the jail, believe it or not. Social workers and stuff I worked with that were amazing. But I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about this warden who ran it, who was like an expert in like micro expressions. Detecting when someone's lying.
That's my favorite cop bullshit science.
Yeah. And I remember he sat me down for like this lecture about it to like go over it. And I mean, it was like fun. I'm like, will this work? Can I try? Like if I look up and to the left, does that mean the person's lying? You know what I mean? There's all these little tiny things I was looking for, but I'm like, I can't believe this is a real science. Someone would really need to convince me of the research behind it before I ever like allowed that in court. Not that I'm a judge or anything, but you know what I mean? So I'm torn on forensic science is the short answer to that.
Yeah, I had a fucking cop in Brady, Texas, pull me over and repeatedly tell me as he was waiting for the dogs because I wouldn't let him search my car that like I've been trained to recognize lying, and I believe that you are lying because like you did this or did that when you say that you don't have any marijuana in the car. And I didn't have any marijuana in the car, but I still wasn't going to let him fucking search me.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the best advice I ever got about being an adult was from my speech and debate coach who got fired because he had not disclosed that he had an arrest on his record or something right after this, but told us if you ever have to lie to a judge, don't break eye contact. Just look a judge or a cop, just look them right in the eye and tell them what they need to hear for you to go home. Boy, and by God, has it worked. Yeah, no, that's gotten me out of trouble a lot of times.
Yeah.
Wow. But yes, as that introduction kind of makes it clear, there are sciences within forensics, like for example, matching DNA. You know, if there's blood at the scene of a murder that does not belong to the victim, and then you find a person with an injury and their blood matches that blood, might suggest that they're the murder, right? There's real science there. I don't think anyone would argue with that. Likewise, you find some fingerprints at the scene on a murder weapon. They match another dude, a person that you catch later. That might suggest that, that person did the murder. However, while both of those things are sciences, both fingerprinting and DNA analysis do not work as well as people often believe. And there's kind of this whole field that's grown up around them because of how solid the actual scientific basis in both fingerprinting and DNA analysis is. They've provided sort of like an umbrella under which a lot of other, or like a canopy, under which like this kind of mushroom cloud of toxic fake forensic science has also grown up. I was mixing my metaphors there, but I think it's forgivable.
Yeah, I got it.
Anyway, that's what we're talking about today, because all forensic science is a bastard. That's not entirely true, but it's as true as forensic science is. So we'll allow, on May 30th, 1997, a Boston police officer entered the backyard of a house in Jamaica Plain. He engaged in a short struggle with an unknown person who ambushed the officer and managed to gain access to his service weapon. The assailant fired twice, wounding the officer, whose last words before losing consciousness probably sounded something like, "Oi, you're from Boston." Sorry, Sophie.
That really
I wasn't not gonna do my award-winning Boston accent.
And the best part is I had no idea it was coming. That's why it worked so well.
I knew it was coming. I have
it was
the
a
script.
sneak attack.
I mean,
it really
look,
got me.
we've all known Boston cops. They all sound like that when they get shot.
It's uncanny.
Yeah. Anyway, he survives, so it's not in bad taste. After shooting the officer, the assailant.
Isn't it though?
I don't think so.
I'm not sure you're off the hook, but go on.
I think I'm fine.
I'm letting you have this one. This fucking Boston police.
After it's been so long since I've brought the Boston accent out, the people have demanded it.
I did see like color go back into your cheeks when you said it. You're like more alive now than you were 2 minutes ago.
Yeah. That's why I got into podcasting, is to do that Boston accent. We just got sidetracked by dictators. So after shooting this cop with his own gun, which has to be embarrassing as a cop, the assailant started shooting at a bystander who was standing by a second-story window watching. Thankfully, doesn't hit this random person, and then he flees the scene, leaving behind nothing but a baseball hat that was knocked off in the struggle. He breaks into a home near where the shooting had taken place because he was thirsty. A family is there, and they watch while he drinks a glass of water and then leaves the cop's gun and his sweatshirt behind. Now, this seems like, well, that's a lot of evidence. You should probably be able to track this guy down, right?
Yeah.
A ton of witnesses, leaves the sweatshirt behind. Yeah. Anyway, it takes about 2 weeks for the injured officer to be well enough to sit in front of a photo array of suspects and potentially identify somebody. And he picks a guy out of this lineup, a man named Steven Cohens, Cowans. And he does this on 2 separate occasions. So the police think, well, that's probably a pretty good ID. The person who had been shot at from his second floor ID'd Cohens too. Now, that sounds, again, this is one of those things where if you see this in like a cop show, where you'd be like, well, then it's obviously him, right? He got ID'd by both people at the scene. But here's the thing, and this is something I hope people are getting more aware of. Eyewitness accounts and identifications are garbage. They're oftentimes worse than nothing at all. People are terrible at recognizing shit that's I remember this one moment during the protests in 2020 where like somebody pulled a gun after like driving their car through a chunk of the protest. And the first thing I heard from like a bunch of different people was like a guy just pulled an AR-15 on a bunch of protesters. And I looked over to Garrison and I was like, I'll bet you fucking anything it was a handgun. And as soon as pictures come out, it's a 9mm handgun. And it's not, people aren't trying to like lie or fantasize. It's like memory is bad. We're bad at remembering things that happen to us.
Yeah. I mean, I assume, especially when you're not expecting to, memorize things when it just happens and like catching it and then looking back. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is why when they train people to, do jobs like, whatever, FBI agents and stuff, there is training in like how to try and like analyze a scene and I think it's debatable as to how well that works, but it is a thing that you need to try and train because we're not naturally good at it. Now, part of why I bring up the fact that these are terrible IDs is that both the cop is kind of ambushed. He doesn't get a good look at this guy who shoots him. He's ambushed and horribly injured. And the guy who looks at him from that second story window and then gets shot at is not close to him, right? The two who identify Cohens as the guy. Right. The family in the house that the assailant forced their way into see the assailant at close range, and they don't ID Cohens. Now, as a journalist, if I'm just trying to like determine what I think is more credible, I'm going to be more credible to the family who was next to the guy not shot. The
guy in your living room, that makes sense. You might be able to recognize that guy.
That's a decent ID, probably, right? Yeah.
You have a better shot.
Yeah, certainly. So the fact that these folks who had been closest to the shooter and spent the most time with him didn't ID Cohens should have been a warning. But their testimony is not what cinched Cohen's conviction, and he is convicted of this crime. Instead, prosecutors used a fingerprint found on the glass of water the assailant drank from in their home. They bring in a fingerprint expert. He concludes the latent print matches Cohens' left thumb. And that sounds pretty bulletproof, right? Fingerprints are real. Matching fingerprints is a real thing you can do. It seems like a good ID. So Cohens goes off to prison where he's going to stay for more than 6 years. He does not accept this conviction because, spoilers, he's innocent. So he fights this as much as he can from prison. And the Innocence Project worked with Cohens for several years, and in 2003, they succeeded in pushing the Suffolk Superior Court to release the glass mug that latent fingerprint had been taken from, swabs of the mug, the baseball hat, and the sweatshirt that the assailant had left behind to do DNA testing and see if any of it matched Cohens. And the DNA tests are conclusive. While the DNA on the hat matched the DNA from the swab, so they knew that the hat that was left at the scene where the officer was shot belonged to the same person who drank from that mug, neither test matched Cohens.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tests on the sweatshirt reveal the same thing, and with this new evidence, the Suffolk DA reanalyzed the fingerprint match that had been used to convict Cohens. Upon re-examination, it was concluded that the fingerprint was not left by Cohens. On January 23rd, 2004, he was released. He lived in freedom for the next 3 years until he was shot to death in 2007 in his own home.
Oh, God.
A really depressing number of Innocence Project people who get released die very soon after getting released for a variety of reasons, including a lot of them, go back into situations where their living situation isn't very safe.
Yeah,
because the time they've spent in prison certainly didn't give them the ability to get into a safer one.
Exactly. I mean, it's also like they probably pick people who are at risk anyways. Those are the people that are being accused of this, or people who probably aren't in fantastic situations to begin with. Then they go to jail.
Yeah.
They spend whatever amount of time not making money, earning an income, learning anything, advancing their lives, and then they have to try and start over. A lot of them are going to be much worse off. So yeah, I'm not shocked to hear that, I guess.
Yeah. Now, Cohens' story, from the use of unreliable forensic science to convict him to his tragic early death after release, is again very common. And just as common as the fact that he was a black man and the officer he was accused of wounding was white. Next to DNA,
it's so fucked up. I'm sorry that I didn't even have to ask his color. I knew,
of course.
I figured that was going to be the situation here, that they were going to just find another guy that matched the color, and that was it.
Yeah, it happens quite often. Now, next to DNA testing, fingerprint matching is one of the most reliable methods of forensic analysis we have. But that fact, which is undeniable, does not mean that it's reliable enough you would want to risk your freedom on it. It does not mean that it's perfect, and it doesn't mean that you can take an expert saying this fingerprint belongs to this person as read, right? None of that is, you simply can't rely on any of that, because there's a big difference between the actual science behind fingerprints and fingerprint forensic science, right? Fingerprinting experts, prosecutors, and law enforcement like to portray it as a thing of objective science where you get 100% confirmation of a perpetrator's presence of a crime scene because you matched them to a fingerprint, and that is not true. Basically, everything you've ever heard about forensic science and fingerprint science is a lie. And outside of stuff like fingerprints and blood, which do at least have a basis in science, most of what is done in the forensic field, or at least a lot of it, has more in common with witchcraft than science. So I'm starting with fingerprinting, both because people should know that it does not work the way they think it does, and because it kind of kickstarts the field of forensic science in the modern sense. And in the U.S., that starts in 1911, when fingerprinting first is used in a court case. So unlike most of what we're talking today, again, this does have real use in catching people who have done bad things. The first case in which fingerprints were introduced as evidence was the 1910 trial of Thomas Jennings, who was accused of murdering Clarence Hiller. And I'm going to quote now from an article by General Mnuchin in Issues in Science and Technology. Quote, "The defendant was linked to the crime by some suspicious circumstantial evidence, but there was nothing definitive against him. However, the Hiller family had just finished painting their house, and on the railing of their back porch, 4 fingers of a left hand had been imprinted in the still wet paint. The prosecution wanted to introduce expert testimony, concluding that these fingerprints belonged to none other than Thomas Jennings. 4 witnesses from various bureaus of identification testified for the prosecution, and all concluded that the fingerprints on the rail were made by the defendant's hand. The judge allowed their testimony, and Jennings was convicted. The defendant argued unsuccessfully on appeal that the prints were improperly admitted. Citing authorities such as the Encyclopedia Britannica and a treatise on handwriting identification, the court emphasized that standard authorities on scientific subjects discuss the use of fingerprints as a system of identification, concluding that experience has shown it to be reliable." And, that's all good. This is probably a case of fingerprinting being used to actually, convict a guy who did a crime, And it's interesting to me that human beings have pretty much always known that there was potential in fingerprints as a method of identification. The idea that they are unique to each individual goes back very far. Ancient Babylonians used fingerprint indentations as part of their records for business transactions. But fingerprinting didn't enter the criminal justice system in an organized way until the mid-1800s. Like most innovations in criminal justice, it was first tested by the British Raj in India, initially as part of a fraud prevention measure, right? A major breakthrough came a few years later in the 1870s, courtesy of a Scottish doctor, Henry Faulds, who was a missionary in Japan. Faulds started inking his coworkers' fingerprints after noticing fingerprints trapped in 2,000-year-old pottery sherds. This led to the first recorded case of a solved crime due to fingerprints. One of his employees was stealing booze from the hospital and drinking it from a beaker. Faulds found a print on the glass and matched it to the culprit. That is apparently the first time a quote-unquote crime.
Whom's amongst us in medicine does not occasionally use a beaker for that purpose? Come on.
Yeah.
That's a crime now? That's a crime?
Yeah. It's bullshit. This is the first great injustice caused by fingerprinting.
Exactly. It's interesting to hear this because it's like, we talked about some of the forensic science stuff before, like the stuff I'm a little more familiar with, like DNA and toxicology. The reason I know about those is because they're kind of born out of like research, out of like universities, hospitals, peer-reviewed journals, etc. But like some of these other things seem like they're born out of like law enforcement, which is like a big difference, it feels like.
And fundamentally not scientific. And even when they're quote unquote using science, their goal is not scientific, because it's always starting from there's a crime and I need to identify who did it. And usually I know who did it and I'm trying to find evidence to prove it. That's going to be one of the recurrent problems in this field. Not with every case, but it's pretty frequent. So Fouts, he's kind of like the first real like person who's trying to study fingerprints like in an actual scientific measure. And he does some cool stuff. He like scrapes the ridges off of his fingertips and then waits for them to grow back and fingerprints himself again to confirm that if you like fuck up your fingerprints, they grow back the same way. He's the guy who like found that children's fingerprints remain the same as they grow up. And in 1880, he wrote a letter to the journal Nature and suggested that police should use fingerprints to identify suspects. And again, this is not initially like in order to catch them. It's more of like when you have people arrested, we can do fingerprints and that can help us like, sort through people. The idea, though, of using them as part of in like a forensic sense starts to pick up steam. And in 1892, a eugenicist and scientist named Sir Francis Galton publishes a book called Fingerprints, which outlines the first attempt at a scientific classification of fingerprints based on patterns of arches, loops, and whorls. Now, around the same time, this French cop named Bertillon developed his own method of measuring people's bodies in order to identify criminals. And as you might have guessed, the science of fingerprinting has always been deeply tied to scientific racism, as these guys all believe that like criminals have physiological differences from law-abiding citizens, right? Bertillon's measuring people's bodies straight. Like, how can you tell from measurements if someone's going to commit crimes,
Right. What does their skull look like?
Exactly. Like these beliefs go hand in hand with the idea that some races are more inclined to criminality than others. But as is always the case with this kind of science, you have this mix of like stuff that's absolute racist hogwash and actual science. And some of what they're doing and trying to like classify fingerprints is actual science and is rigorous. The classification system for fingerprints that wins out at the end of the 19th century is a modification of Galton's. It was tested by British police in India and adopted by Scotland Yard in 1901. Fingerprints were accepted for the first time in English courts in 1902, and of course the first recorded court case in the U.S. Using fingerprint evidence is like 1910 and 1911, as previously discussed. By the mid-century, fingerprinting has cemented itself as the most scientific and unimpeachable tool for confirming guilt. A whole industry of experts grows up alongside the discipline, and hundreds of men and women begin to make their careers as experts on fingerprinting for the police and the court system. In case studies published in scientific journals and in statements to the media, these experts reinforce the idea that fingerprinting was a hard, objective science. Mnookin writes, quote, "Writers on fingerprinting routinely emphasize that fingerprint identification could not be erroneous. Unlike so much other expert evidence, which could be and generally was disputed by other qualified experts, fingerprint examiners seemed always to agree. Generally, the defendants in fingerprinting cases did not offer fingerprint experts of their own because no one challenged fingerprinting in court, either its theoretical foundations or, for the most part, the operation of the technique in that particular instance. It seemed especially powerful. The idea that fingerprints could provide definite matches was not contested in court. In the early trials in which fingerprints were introduced, some defendants argued that fingerprinting was not a legitimate form of evidence, but typically defendants did not introduce fingerprint experts of their own. Fingerprinting thus avoided the spectacle of clashing experts on both sides of a case, whose contradictory testimony befuddled jurors and frustrated judges." And so you see why this is so powerful, right? Every other kind of expert you might bring into a court case, there could be a counter expert to say, here's another explanation. But if fingerprinting's a hard science, there can't be. It's like DNA, right? There can't be two opinions on whether or not someone's DNA matches, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, like if I have the facts right about the O.J. Simpson case, that was part of the problem, is that the defense never actually had their own DNA expert, because I don't think they could find someone that would do it. But this is a major issue in general nowadays, maybe forever. You have someone who seems like a very authoritative figure. Maybe they have some titles behind their name. They speak in a certain way. listened to my podcast, recent episode about Andrew Huberman, for example, and they seem like a very learned man of books, and who's a jury to say at that point, well, this person seems to know what they're saying. This person seems very worldly and intelligent, and they seem to be an expert, and they're the authority on it. So yeah, okay, yeah, obviously this is the person that did the crime.
Yeah, and that's what happens, right? And it's this kind of sea change in the way that the justice system works, because suddenly you have this thing that is in a total class of its own as far as evidence goes, right? Now, here's the thing. Fingerprinting is not like DNA analysis, and by the way, DNA analysis, while it is real and does work quite well, also isn't perfect. There are errors. People make mistakes. There are mistaken, that is a thing that can happen, but it is an objective science, right? Like there's a lot of study on that. The fingerprints analysis is not an objective science in the way that you would consider anything from like medical science to be an objective science. One of the pieces of evidence for that is that there are no, from state to state, what counts as a fingerprint ID differs wildly, right? So there's a case, Daubert, that is kind of the case that currently establishes like what counts as science when you're like introducing expert evidence into court, right? And under the Daubert judgment, judges are supposed to examine whether or not, judge whether or not something can be admitted based on whether or not the expert evidence has been adequately tested, if it has a known error rate, and if there's standards and techniques that like control the operation, and it's subject to peer review, right? Yeah. Which sounds reasonable. But judges are not scientists, right? Mm-hmm. And they often mistake stuff that sounds like evidence of peer review, but really isn't. And some of the evidence for this is that like fingerprinting examiners often use point counting, which is a method where you count the number of ridge characteristics on the prints in order to like say these are identical prints. But there is no nationally recognized fixed requirement for how many points of similarity are needed. Some states it's 6, some states it's 9, some states it's 12. That's not science.
Yeah. No, and I'm so glad you brought up error rate studies, because that's sort of like an important part of like determining if a test will be a good one or not, Yeah. And it feels like judges are, and not a lawyer, but it feels like judges are, more likely to allow evidence to come in, even if it's sort of questionable, because they're worried about maybe like excluding something that would be important. So they'll allow it to go in, even if it's sort of like they don't understand the science. My guess is they would be more willing to allow it than to be strict about excluding it unless they understood the science really well.
Yeah, and the problem is that like all of these people have really impressive sounding credentials, and they are all part of what appear to be scientific bodies. And in fact, in a lot of cases, we'll talk about some of these organizations, are bodies that a lot of what they do is scientific, but there's just not actually oversight, right? Like Mnookin sums up kind of the current state of how like messy this is well when they write, local practices vary and no established minimum or norm exists. Others reject point counting for a more holistic approach. Either way, there are no generally agreed upon standards for determining precisely when to declare a match. Although fingerprint experts insist that a qualified expert can infallibly know when 2 fingerprints match, there is in fact no carefully articulated protocol for ensuring that different experts reach the same conclusion. And that's a problem, right? Imagine if like cancer diagnosis worked this way. If like every hospital was like, well, this is what we consider cancers,
I mean, also part of the thing is this, to some degree, there is uncertainty in medicine. Like say if you had a pathology report and you take a biopsy of something and a pathologist looks at it, they do have criteria. They have to be like, okay, is there a certain amount of these types of cells I'm seeing? And if there's a question, then they reach out to someone else to review it and and look over it. But that is known to us. Like in medicine, at least we're known to like, okay, this is the degree of certainty we have here. It's not 100%, but this is what we have. And sometimes that happens. So there's a transparency there that's important. You know what I mean?
And likewise, there is a science within the approach of fingerprint analysis because people have fingerprints and we know, they're generally unique to each person, based on the best data that we have. But these people are not getting up and saying, based on this established, framework that is universally agreed upon, there's this percentage of likelihood that this is a match.
Yeah,
They're saying, I can tell as an expert, this is infallibly a match.
Right.
You know?
Makes you so much more valuable as an expert.
Right. Yeah. It's messy. So fingerprinting takes off and again, the fact that this is really deeply flawed and fucks a lot of people over, it doesn't mean that's what it does in the majority of cases, right? I'm not saying that. I actually kind of suspect that in the majority of cases, it's reasonably good, right? But that still leaves a lot of people to fall through the cracks and get their lives ruined by imperfect and badly applied scientific reasoning. There was no serious questioning of fingerprinting as a method of forensic science until the end of the 20th century, when DNA profiling began to enter common use. This questioning started ironically with questions by defendants as to the legitimacy of DNA matches, right? So DNA evidence starts being introduced in court cases, and because the science is so new and is not as straightforward to understand as matching to fingerprints, there's a lot more debate in court cases about what it means to match DNA samples and how likely it is that such matches might be made in error. And that kind of causes some people to go, did we ever subject fingerprinting to this level of scrutiny? Perhaps we should. we might want to look into this some, Yeah. Because it hadn't had to answer these questions, right?
It wasn't. I mean, not to say that Western medicine and universities and all the stuff that I'm used to is like the end all be all, but because again, it didn't come out of those places where it was already a part of the process. It was baked into it.
And by the way, it's good that DNA matching was subject to a lot of scrutiny. Everything should when people's lives are on the line, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So the sheer act of publicly debating the matter brings new scrutiny to fingerprinting. And once DNA science was accepted, because it is the best thing we've got for when it comes to this sort of stuff, it helps to ignite a new series of questions as to whether or not fingerprinting was as rock solid a discipline as its expert practitioners claimed. One of the first things you'll hear, and I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast has heard the claim, no two people have the same fingerprints, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, how would you prove that?
I mean, I suppose you would have to do a ton of testing and you would have to test a bunch of people and see if there's any people that have the same one. And you'd have to have a pretty big N or number of people involved in the study to prove it.
It doesn't really exist. Now, it is based on the sheer number of people who have been fingerprinted, very likely that fingerprints are unique. But this is just common wisdom that started being said. It isn't something that was introduced that people started claiming because they had done a big study, right?
Yeah.
Again, the sheer length of time that we have been doing fingerprinting, it's pretty likely that this is the case. But it was not something people started saying because they had a good fucking reason to say it. It was something people started claiming as an advertising method, right?
Interesting.
And the fact that it is likely true doesn't mean that that's not kind of sketchy.
Right. And we're dealing with people's lives again.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of advertising and sketchy, it's about that time. About that time.
This podcast is supported entirely by the concept of DNA. DNA.
Get some.
Here's the
what
thing.
else are you going to do? Be a silicon-based life form? No, you're not.
It's going to be one of those, if you do get one of those, spit into a thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, don't do those things, people. Those things are bullshit. They're going to sell your fucking data to somebody sketchy.
If you do get an ad for that, that wasn't our fault.
Yeah. Also, I might take their money in the future, but it's bullshit. It's bullshit. We're back. And I just want to say to our listeners who are silicon-based life forms, I don't have any issue with silicon-based life. I'm a big rock monster fan. I think you guys should have the same rights that the rest of us have. I'm looking forward to our first rock monster president. I assume it'll be like the guy from Galaxy Quest. And I think that would be a lot better for this country, to be honest.
Man,
who
progress.
can say they wouldn't prefer a rock monster to the choices we're currently looking at?
Better rock or boy, I was looking for a red or dead sort of thing, but I couldn't with rock or go rock or you suck.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to be able to accomplish a lot proactively, but I do think if we were to let a rock monster loose in Congress, it would be generally good for everyone.
It's the little things, just like that scene in Galaxy Quest.
Yeah, just like that scene in Galaxy Quest. The little things. It's the simple things.
Great
in
Tony
life
Shalhoub reference.
Everybody in that movie knocks it out of the park.
Fantastic
Even
movie.
Tim Allen, and I hate Tim Allen.
Exactly. God, I thought the same exact thing.
Anyway, I can already hear some people saying, I get that the whole every fingerprint is unique thing isn't something that you can conclusively prove, but you just admitted it's probably true. You're just kind of splitting hairs by complaining about experts claiming that they're sure of something. And I don't think I am splitting hairs here. The power of fingerprinting in the criminal justice system comes from its presumed unimpeachability. People have been killed repeatedly in large numbers on the certainty that fingerprint analysts know what they're doing, and we have data that shows they often don't. Here's Mnookin again. Quote, although some FBI proficiency tests show examiners making few or no errors, these tests have been criticized, even by other fingerprint examiners, as unrealistically easy. Other proficiency tests shown more disturbing results. In one 1995 test, 34% of test takers made an erroneous identification, especially when an examiner evaluates a partial latent print, a print that may be smudged, distorted, and incomplete. It is impossible, on the basis of our current knowledge, to have any real idea of how likely she is to make an honest mistake. And maybe it's much lower, but honestly, if 10% of the time an average fingerprint examiner is fucking up, that's a sizable error rate, especially if your life is on the line, and 34% is real fucking bad.
Yeah, that's a big number.
I mean, this is fine if you are making this kind of data aware, if the jury is aware of it, and if you were saying stuff like, we got some imperfect fingerprints and they suggest it might be this person, but our level of confidence is maybe 59% or whatever, right? That. So we think that it's likely, but we can't prove it. You give that information to a jury, I think a reasonably intelligent person can put that in context with other evidence.
Exactly.
But that's not how it's presented a lot of the time.
You don't have to throw it out. I mean, you should use it, but we need to at least know the limitations of it, at least be transparent with the science or lack thereof behind it.
And this is where we get to the problem where there's not a lot of counter experts. And when there are, it's because someone has the money to pay for them. So the people who do not have the ability to introduce the doubt that ought to be present with a lot of these fingerprint analyses are poor people,
Right. Yeah. You're right.
And that's who gets often, it's not a bunch of rich people going to prison for bad fingerprint analysis primarily.
Yeah. They can afford the people. I mean, there's DAs who are overworked, I'm sure, trying to defend them. How are they going to get that together? It sounds like it would be a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it's too much to ask for the average public defender who is already dealing with way too many fucking cases on zero money.
Yeah.
So published studies on fingerprinting tend to be case studies where after conviction, an expert will walk the reader through this process. That looks to a layman like a scientific study, but it's not. That's analyzing a case in which somebody got convicted and walking through your work, as opposed to actually trying to objectively find good data on how often the matches these people make are right. Because there's not really any good way to do that. You often don't find out that someone's been wrongly convicted on the basis of, it'll take 10, 15, 20 years, right? Getting this kind of information on how flawed this field is took a lot of time, and a lot of people have gotten hurt in the interim. In 2004, Brandon Mayfield was a lawyer in Portland, Oregon, and a pretty prominent one, too. He had recently represented the so-called Portland Seven, a group of local Muslims who'd been convicted of conspiring to support the Taliban after 9/11. That year, he went on vacation to Madrid, and my God, this man picked the worst time to go on vacation to Madrid anyone has ever picked. A group of Islamic extremists carried out a terrorist attack on a commuter train while he was in Madrid that killed nearly 200 people. Because the FBI be how the FBI do, they flew in to help out the Spanish authorities, and they identified a partial print on a plastic bag that had contained detonators and traced it to Brandon. Brandon, who was on their shit list because he had defended these guys they had accused of supporting the Taliban. Right. In the book Junk Science, Innocence Project lawyer Chris Fabricant writes, "To the FBI, Mayfield looked good for it. Spanish fingerprint experts disagreed, but the FBI would not back down. A court-appointed expert conducted an additional examination and confirmed the FBI's conclusions. Mayfield remained jailed, virtually incommunicado, for weeks. Only after Spanish police associated the fingerprints with an Algerian national named Daoud Onain did the FBI admit it was wrong, and Mayfield was finally released. After which he successfully sued for $2 million and elicited something rarer than money from the FBI, a public apology.
Oh, wow. Good on him. Strong.
Yeah.
Strong work.
Yeah, very rare. It shows you how much they fucked up, right? Yeah. And also, they made the mistake of going after a fucking lawyer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thankfully, I mean, this is obviously, my heart goes out to him for how stressful this must have been, but at least he had the capacity to defend himself.
Yeah.
Now, with hindsight, we can see that the prime reasons the FBI went after Mayfield was that he himself was a convert to Islam who had represented accused terrorists. But at the time, they argued that their experts couldn't be biased. They were using unimpeachable science, even though their experts disagreed with Spanish experts who were presumably using the same science.
And they were more experter.
If you're, again, framing this to the people making choices accurately, that's no worse than saying, like, well, this doctor says someone likely has this syndrome, but this doctor has a different conclusion because this is just not something we understand well, right? But that's not how it's being presented. It came out later that the court-appointed expert brought in for Mayfield's case, the guy who found a match that matched the FBI's case, had been informed before doing his analysis that the elite FBI fingerprint analysts had found a match before he made his report, right? So that is that's bad science. If someone is conducting is attempting to like analyze a fingerprint to determine if it's a match, you shouldn't tell them beforehand that another analyst has made a match because that could prejudice them, right?
It's not blinded study. It's very unblinded. I don't know. Open-eyed.
Yeah, but that happens all the time with this shit because, again, it's dressed as science, but it's not treated that way by a lot of its practitioners, which is, again, a lot of the people who are criticizing these bad identifications are fingerprint analysts who do treat it as a science. My issue is not that those people don't exist. It's that it is not standardized that that's the expectation for how a fingerprint analyst should operate, you know? This was a public enough fuck up that a cognitive neuroscientist conducted a rare study into how cognitive bias might inform results in forensic studies. He got 6 fingerprint experts and he gave them 8 sets of prints to analyze. Unbeknownst, I love this study.
I was about to say, I love studies like this. They're the best.
This one's real fun because unbeknownst to them, all the sets they were analyzing came from previous cases they had analyzed. So all of these guys had gotten these prints before and made IDs in court cases.
Nice touch.
And then they're given the same prints, but not told they're the same prints.
Oh, that's fucking fantastic.
2/3 of them came to different conclusions while analyzing the same fingerprints a second time.
That's so amazing. You know what it reminds me of? If I may tangent for just one moment, one of my favorite studies I ever saw, it was a study of like wine connoisseurs. Because you know how there's people who love wine. You've heard they've done some variation of the study a number of times where they took like a bottle of wine and they had it in like a paper bag and they had another bottle of wine in a paper bag and they said, hey, look, these are like wine aficionados, people who are like, sommeliers, etc.
Yeah, and they said wine nerds.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They said, this one is like $100 bottle of wine. This one's like a $10 bottle of wine. Rate, review them, use whatever words you want to describe them. And they would, generally rate them very differently. They would describe them very differently. And they were the same exact bottle of wine. And it was just like so objective, how objective this thing can be.
This happens a lot. It happens with pot, right? There's a lot of pots where people are like, well, this one will get you this kind of high and this one will get you this kind of high. And like, that's kind of true in that different levels of like different cannabinoids can affect the high. But like a lot of what people say about like different strains of pot is bunk. And the same thing happens with kratom where they'll be like, well, they've got this kind and this kind and this kind. It's like, well, it's just kind of matters how much of the active ingredient is in it.
Yeah, right.
But it's also like, with a wine sommelier, with, drug nerds or whatever, what's the harm of some guy being like, I know all of the wines and have the best wine taste.
Right.
It's fine. You're not hurting anybody.
Yeah.
The worst case scenario is some rich people pay more money for a fancier wine experience. Yeah. With the fingerprint stuff, it's a real problem. But I do think it's kind of worth comparing to that sommelier study, because it is kind like really similar. And again, the point here is not that fingerprint analysis is bunk science or useless. It's that fingerprint analysts are not performing objective science. They are making judgments based on their opinions. They are often being informed ahead of time. We think this guy did it. Can you tell us if the fingerprint matches? Which is not how it should work. It's the same thing with, like, you'll hear a lot about how great fucking police dogs are and how they can identify if you've got a little bit of a speck of marijuana in, a fucking car or whatever full of stuff. They've got these incredible noses, and dog noses are that incredible. Also, that's not how police dogs work. Police dogs are primarily paying attention to when the police officer expects to find drugs and where, and alerting off of that. That's how they work. Ask me how I know.
I really want to know.
Because I beat him once.
Can we talk about this? Can we talk about it?
I'd gotten pulled over, and this is like fucking 15 years over, pulled over with pot in a car. They brought the dogs out. I had been told by an old head that, like, yeah, man, if you get pulled over by the police dogs, look anywhere but at the car. Do not look at the vehicle while they're doing anything, because the cop is watching you to see when you get nervous, when the dog gets to a part of your car where the drugs are, and then the cop will he believed that the cops had a secret signal to the dogs. I think it's actually more likely that you tense up when the dog gets near where the drugs are. The cop sees you tense up, and the dog sees the cop tense up. Maybe both of those things are happening. Sure. There have been studies on this, though. You can actually read into this. They do not work as well as they say they do. It is easy for police dogs to be biased because the dog doesn't know what it's actually doing. Right?
Yeah, right.
The dog is trying to make people happy.
Yeah,
that's all the dog's trying to do.
Yeah. So you want me to smell? Yeah, I'll smell now. You want me? Okay, yeah, sure.
Dogs are capable of that kind of scent analysis, but that doesn't mean that's what they're always doing. Just like fingerprint analysts are capable of analyzing fingerprints on the scene and matching them to a person, but that doesn't mean that's what they're doing every time they claim they're doing that.
Right, yeah.
Yep. Bias be a thing.
Bias.
And this is the case with every other kind of investigative technique in criminal justice, but forensic science is not treated that way. Part of why is that there's an awful lot of money in ensuring that it is treated as hard scientific truth. The success fingerprint experts have enjoyed in this arena has inspired other would-be experts to build their own careers, peddling science much more questionable than fingerprint analysis. But you know what's a lot more questionable than even that, Kaveh?
Boy, I hope it's some sort of very morally questionable ad.
It is. It's an ad for, I don't know. I don't actually know what's more morally questionable than our current advertisers. So just buy whatever they're selling. We're back, Kaveh.
Yeah, I'm back too.
Fingerprint analysis is fun. By fun, I mean it's infuriating how often it does not work the way it's supposed to, but it is at least based in real stuff. Now I'm going to bring us to a true villain, to some absolute real bullshit forensic science. And of course, the true villain of this episode, Kaveh, is history's greatest monster, dentists.
Didn't expect it. Got me again.
ADAB, baby.
All dead. Yes.
No good dentists.
Right. Yeah.
So this part of the story starts in September 1982, when 22-year-old Teresa Perrin noticed a sailor hitchhiking near her coastal Virginia home. Seeing sailors in uniform was not odd where she lived. There was an aircraft carrier dock nearby, and her husband worked at a nearby naval base. But when she failed to pick this man up, he screamed at her. And later in the day, she noticed a similar-looking man in a sailor uniform loitering outside her house as she dried her laundry. She went on with her day somewhat agitated until her husband came home, and she was finally able to get to sleep. She wakes up in the middle of the night to see a man in a sailor's uniform standing above her. He beats her husband to death with a crowbar while he sleeps, and then he rapes Teresa repeatedly. The granular details, I mean, this goes on. I am telling you this is a hideous fucking case. What happens to this woman is just an absolute nightmare. And the whole time she's basically doing everything she can to like keep him happy because her kids are also in the house and she doesn't want him to kill them too. It's just a fucking nightmare. One thing I do, again, I'm not going to try to go into too much detail, but I do have to note for what comes next that when the man raped her for the second time, he bit her repeatedly on the thighs, hard enough to leave a mark. This is crucial to what comes next. Teresa survives, thankfully, and the case immediately, obviously, becomes the biggest news in town, right? This guy gets away, and it's, of course, people freak out, right? There is some unbelievably violent, horrible man on the loose. Like, a literal monster on the loose. This is one of those cases where everyone panics and it's like, yeah, man, I'd be sleeping with a fucking gun every night, you know?
Yeah. Boy, terrible story.
Yeah. I would be putting the family in the fucking panic room and have a rifle by my goddamn side.
Like you don't already.
Like I don't already. So Teresa was given a rape kit by a doctor, and her injuries were documented in detail. She was shown mugshots, but no clear culprit materialized. A security guard at the base reported that he had seen a sailor with blood on his uniform enter the shipyard gate at 2:30 a.m. I will note that, that seems like, well, obviously that's the guy. If you've known Navy men, a sailor showing up with blood on their uniform at 2:30 in the morning to go to bed, not uncommon. Doesn't mean they've necessarily committed a murder.
Right.
Sometimes that's just how sailors be. Given the time Teresa said the assault had taken place, this guy could not have been the culprit, right? 2:30 a.m., according to her, and again, she's awake with this guy. He's there for hours. According to when she said the assault took place, this guy with blood on his uniform couldn't have been the one who did it. It had to have just been a coincidence. But the DA in this case has the security guard hypnotized. The security guard who said, this guy came in at 2:30 a.m. And after being hypnotized, the security guard says, no, he came in at 5 a.m. Now, that's already very questionable.
I can't think of a softer science than hypnosis.
Than hypnotism. Yes, that is wow. That is the chinchilla fur of forensic science.
That was so nice. Sometimes I'm so proud of you. And that reference right there was one of the beautiful moment. Beautiful.
So unfortunately, and this is, we'll talk about hypnotism some other day. This is kind of really at a peak point in the early 80s of hypnotism being introduced into court cases. This also plays into the Satanic Panic, which is happening around the same time. But they decide to have Teresa, the DA, has Teresa hypnotized as well. And after being hypnotized, she claims that the sailor who attacked her was definitely the same guy as the hitchhiking sailor who had yelled at her earlier. Obviously, a shitload of sailors are in town. The idea that one of them would be a murderer and a rapist and not the same guy who just yelled at her randomly when she drove past him in town, pretty actually good odds that they're not the same guy. But the DA that's an easier line of logic. So the DA, has her hypnotized and then she changes her story, right? To be I'm sure it was the same guy. Wow. So again, already just from a fact standpoint, we're not off to a great start with this case with trying to track down the culprit.
Yeah. That's on real 80s movie of the week, sort of we use hypnosis. It's a brand new science out of Europe to get these people to open up their minds more. It's terrible. It's so depressing.
It's rough stuff. And based on this very flawed information, it is decided that the man who had attacked her must be a sailor on the nearby USS Carl Vinson. Now, again, this is the aircraft carrier that's in town. Pretty good chance that the guy who attacked her was, but also not the only sailors in town. So the district attorney on the case, Willard Robinson, asked the captain of the Carl Vinson to provide the state with dental records for all 1,300 of the sailors under his command. That way, a dental expert could analyze them. He had already had an expert analyze Teresa's bites, and the expert had concluded that the assailant had possessed a pointed front tooth that was misaligned. Now, extensive analysis did not come forward with any clear identification. The case languished, and the family started complaining to elected officials, and both the DA and Navy felt extreme pressure to resolve the case. Then, in March, a 26-year-old sailor on the Vinson, Keith Allen Harward, was arrested over a domestic dispute. He was drunk as hell during this fight and is alleged to have bitten his girlfriend. Again, that sounds damning until I note that he bites her after she hits him with a frying pan, which does make it sound less like this guy is a biting psychopath and more like, well, this was just a real bad relationship.
Wow. That's a very toxic relationship. The frying pan's an interesting touch. That's a nice touch.
That is, I mean, yeah, again, you wouldn't call this good behavior, but it's hardly like evidence that this man is a murderer. But once he's in custody, you've got a sailor and he bit somebody, you know? Not surprising.
He's a biter.
He's a biter. Yeah, right. So he starts to look pretty good to this increasingly desperate DA who is really getting pressured to solve this fucking case. Now, because this guy was on the Carl Vinson and they'd provided dental records to the state, this guy's teeth had already been looked at, and experts had analyzed his teeth and said he couldn't be the man who had bit Teresa, right? So that's a problem. Now, I'm going to read from a write-up in the National Registry of Exonerations, which should give you an idea of where this case ends up. Quote, Harward had been among those whose teeth were examined in the immediate aftermath of the investigation, but he had been ruled out as the source of the bite marks on Teresa by a civilian dental consultant working with a Newport News City medical examiner. When Harward came to court, Teresa was there, but could not identify him as the attacker. At that point, police asked Harward to submit to a second procedure to obtain a cast of his teeth. The cast was sent to Lowell Levine, then a budding superstar in the fledgling field of bite mark analysis, who had gained fame for his testimony linking bite marks to serial killer Ted Bundy and to Nazi war criminal Joseph Mengele. Levine concluded that Harward was responsible for the bite marks on Teresa's body. Police showed a photographic lineup to Wade, who selected Harward's picture as the man who came through the security gate with a blood-spattered uniform. On May 16, 1983, police arrested Harward on charges of capital murder, rape, robbery, and burglary. He is ultimately convicted, and he is sentenced to life in prison. He appealed that, and the Virginia Supreme Court did grant him a new trial. In 1986, Levine testified at this, that's the bite mark guy, testified at this second trial that there was a, quote, very, 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 very high degree of probability that Harward's teeth had made the bite marks. Now, that's not scientific language, so he followed by assuring jurors there that there was a, quote, practical impossibility that someone else would have all these characteristics that Levine found in the bite marks. And again, what we have here is a real science that is providing cover for a pseudoscience, because dental analysis is very real thing. You can like that's how we identify dead bodies and stuff by their dental records all the time. You know, dental analysis is a thing. This guy is good at dental analysis. Bite mark analysis, not a thing in the same way. I'm going to say you can never identify a bite mark and match them to someone's teeth, but it is not the same as identifying someone by their dental records. Because,
can I give an example of this?
Yeah, please.
Wrestling with my 3 children, and somebody bit me. It left a mark, and I was like, all right, I should be able to determine, because it was really deep into my flesh, which one of the little bastards did this. And when I held up all their teeth, like to the bite, they all looked like they could have gone in. They all look like they could have been the one. Like, there's no way to tell. I know that's not scientific. I'm just telling you my experience, but I feel like I see where you're going with this.
Your experience does hint at the actual science, which is that you have 2 problems, key problems, when it comes to trying to identify a bite mark in this way. If the person who is bit survives, as Teresa does, once you are bit, you start to heal. That process of reacting to the injury, which includes swelling up, which can include getting infected, which eventually includes like the healing of the injury, starts immediately. So by the time your injuries are analyzed, and it's likely, cops generally, when they come onto the scene of a rape and murder, the first thing you're doing is not carefully documenting the bite marks in such a way that it will be helpful to a forensic dentist necessarily. Already, that bite mark has started to change. Right? In fact, it's going to change immediately, because generally, like when you bite someone hard enough, they swell up, and that's going to alter the look of that bite mark. Likewise, if you've got a corpse that, someone got murdered and they were bit, decomposition also starts immediately. So you cannot say that the skin, like our human skin, is not like a dental cast,
Right.
you know?
Right. And you're exactly right. Like there is a difference between someone analyzing like teeth, remains of teeth, and being like, these belong to this person or et cetera, you know? There's a difference between that and saying, well, this bite is related to this person because of, there's all these other factors that tie into that, these mechanical factors and all these variables that like, it seems like it would be difficult. Maybe there are scientists who can prove me wrong on that, but I could see this being a much more difficult process than just identifying teeth.
It is, again, I'm not saying it's a thing you could never do, but it is not in any way the same kind of thing as identifying someone from their dental records. But because Levine is the guy who got famous identifying people from their dental records, and now he is testifying about bite marks, it sure seems like the same thing to again, the people who are not dentists or scientists.
He's an authority. He's an authority.
Exactly.
How you do not believe him?
Now, Harward's testimony, again, because the Supreme Court gives him the second case after Levine says, like, it's impossible for someone else to have all the characteristics I found in these bite marks. Harward's testimony includes some pretty good counter evidence to exonerate him, including the fact that he had an alibi. During the time Teresa had been attacked, he had been at a mandatory drug and alcohol abuse program after being caught aboard with weed. He had an alibi. Also, Teresa specifically recalled the rank on the man's uniform because, again, her husband works at the naval base. She knows this kind of stuff. And Harward's rank insignia did not match the insignia she recalled seeing on her attacker. None of this mattered. Harward was sentenced again, largely on the strength of the bite mark analysis, and would spend 30 years in prison.
Wow.
Now, again, just as a spoiler, he's innocent. Let's take a look at this expert, Lowell Levine. At the time of the case, he was the most prominent bite mark analyst in the country. His CV took a full half hour to read in court, and that was, a strategy on behalf of the prosecution. In the early 1970s, though, before this case begins, he was just another dentist, and it's generally it's a little bit of a, this is debatable, but some people will argue that dentists struggle with depression and dissatisfaction in their jobs at high levels compared to other health professionals.
Yeah, high rates of suicide, I've been told. Yeah. Yes. Compared to other health professionals. Yeah.
There's some evidence of that, although it is actually kind of inconclusive. It is worth noting that between 2003 and 2021 alone, the number of dentists experiencing extreme anxiety tripled. But again, that might have more to do with COVID than anything else.
Right.
I don't know. It's inconclusive, but I bring this up just because the young Dr. Levine seemed kind of unfulfilled in his career cleaning teeth and more interested in the sexy, daring work of a forensic detective. He wrote an article for New York Journal of Medicine titled Dentistry, an Emerging Forensic Science. Bite mark analysis had never been used in a court case before, but Levine pitched the idea, as Chris Fabricant notes in the book Junk Science. To truly gain acceptance by his colleagues as a forensic scientist and recognition as an expert, Levine advocated for some sort of certification. The dentists had to more than contribute to victim identification. Bite marks could be very valuable to be able to establish the identity of the perpetrator of the bite for legal purposes, Levine argued. But he also acknowledged that there was a sea of knowledge we must accumulate before we are willing to make positive identifications in court involving homicide cases, and he was candid about the lack of an objective scientific basis to the new technique. As a result, bite marks will never be truly comparable to a fingerprint since we cannot reproduce the 3 dimensions of the bitten surface. So that's what he writes in the 70s, and that's all kind of reasonable, huh?
I think it's very reasonable. I feel for the guy. I'll tell you why. I'm a gastroenterologist, as you know, and I've been pitching this idea of being a forensic proctologist and solving crimes through the dead anus, like reading Rings on Trees sort of thing.
Right.
I've been pitching this show to NBC for a while. I haven't gotten any positive feedback yet, but I'm not going to stop because I think there's something to this. And so I understand where this guy's coming from. I get it.
Yeah, it's like Mindhunter, but for butts. Butt Hunter.
Butt Hunter.
Yeah.
Well, there it is. Nailed it.
Ma'am, I know you're very distraught right now because your whole family was murdered, but what can you tell me about what the inside of the man's ass probably looked like?
We're going to need to look at your husband's butthole. I'm sorry.
So, again, this guy writes 10 years or so before the Harward case, bite marks will never be comparable to a fingerprint. They can't be for very, basic reasons. 10 years later, though, Levine is a board-certified member of the American Board of Forensic Odontology, and he testifies scientific certainty that Mr. Harward caused the bite mark on Teresa Peron's leg, a thing 10 years ago he said you couldn't do with bite marks. And his certainty was so convincing that the two dentists who had ruled that Harward hadn't been the biter changed their testimony based on his.
Wow.
So, how he and his colleagues accomplished this was that they forced their way into the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and, as he'd written, created a board-certifying entity to ensure they could back up their claims whenever they would analyze a bite mark with titles that sounded impressive to judges and juries. This all started with a conference at a hotel in Chicago with Levine and 7 other dentists who had been working ad hoc as experts for prosecutors at local medical examiner offices. They recognized how much money and respect could be theirs if they locked down a more formal role, and they knew the AAFS was the way to do it. The American Academy of Forensic Sciences was the most influential body in the field, and membership was seen as something of a rubber stamp that whatever forensic science you were pushing is the real shit.
It's the good stuff. That's how you do it. That's how you do it.
Yeah. This is like a very clever plan. So these odontologists knew that if they get in and if they, have suddenly a certification, that's going to make it impossible for any layman defense attorney to question their claims, which is going to make them very valuable for prosecutors. They are looking at what's happened with fingerprint experts, and they want the same thing for bite marks. The AAFS obviously includes a lot of real experts because there are real forensic scientists, and people in the AFS are trying their level best to help solve horrible crimes, but it also includes a lot of grifter assholes who want money and respect and don't care how many people get wrongly convicted for that to be possible. So when, again, I say all this both because I'm deeply critical of this organization for what comes next, and also I think a lot of the people who are not, odontologists in this organization probably see what Levine and the others are claiming about bite marks and assume they know their shit because they're doctors, you know? And because not just because of that, odontologists had always been a big part of forensics because dental records that's a real way to identify remains, So these folks feel like Levine and his crew are the real deal, even though bite mark analysis has nothing to do with IDing corpses via dental records. And I want to read a quote from Fabricant's book, just sort of laying into how flawed this is. Bite mark analysis involves subjective interpretation of a bruise on skin and guessing whether it could have been made by teeth, and if so, whether a particular suspect's teeth made the mark. Few appreciate that the subdisciplines of forensic odontology have nothing whatsoever to do with each other, though they can be made to sound like they do. Forensic dentists identify people through their teeth and through the bite marks their teeth make. That sounds straightforward, but it's actually more like a geologist claiming that because he can identify rocks, he can identify the rock that was used to bash someone's skull. And geologists out there's a lot of money for you if you want to take that one up. So,
business idea number 33. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Using real forensic dentistry as cover, Levine and his cadre of, I can't call them grifters legally, but I'm very critical of these people, slide into the AAFS. They are accepted despite the fact that there's not a lot of them, and crucially, there's not any rigorous scientific data laying out the objective best practices for comparing bite marks to teeth. A lot of real experts might point out that there are deep flaws in the again, what everything I've said about like tissue, it's kind of the only really good bite marks that you can do a cast of someone's teeth and match to the bite mark is what are called, it's basically like cartilage bites, right? Like if you get bit in the nose, you can sometimes get a really good bite mark from that because cartilage keeps the mark better.
Yeah, it doesn't heal as well.
Skin. Right. Yeah. So this is, again, these guys are real dentists. They know this. They know that if they want to like make the case that this is a real science, they need like a famous court case that they solve with bite mark analysis. And because very few bite marks can actually be analyzed with rigorous science, they're kind of like waiting for a while to find the perfect case to like make a big splash with. This is a tough thing. You need a case that's horrific enough that it captures imaginations and gets media attention, and bite marks need to be involved somehow. And most importantly, the suspect needs to be poor, so that he can't hire experts of his own.
It's such a bummer to take a step back for a second and be like, there's enough bite related crime, like there's vicious attacks so terrible that people are biting in this animalistic way, victims biting people. Like this is like a thing that's developing. That's kind of a weird concept for me to understand. Like that's common enough that this is even something that they're trying to look for.
Yeah. It is.
People
that
are
is
the worst. People are weird. Bites.
In February of 1974, Levine and his colleagues got their dream case. A 73-year-old woman was beaten, stabbed in the genitals, and murdered. She had been bitten on the tip of her nose, and it created the perfect bite mark for forensic dentistry. Levine had written 2 years prior about the need for such a 3D bite mark, which was rare to establish the legitimacy of his field. Now they had it. The prosecutor in this case suspected that Walter Marks was the guilty party because he had rented a room from her. But there was no actual evidence that he had committed the crime, so the prosecutor reached out to 3 dentists, and they responded by saying the judge needed to subpoena Marks for a cast of his teeth. Marks refused, and so a judge jailed him for 6 weeks until he complied. Now, Fabricant notes that the mere process of forcing someone to have a mold taken is biasing, right? That it can bias like the people analyzing that mold because like, well, why would this be taken unless there was a reason to believe this guy was guilty, you know? And no structures were set up within the field of bite mark analysis to ensure that people comparing molds of wounds and teeth were objective, right? Looking at the information purely as information rather than acting as paid members of a prosecution team. Jerry Vale, one of the dentists brought in for the case, was over the moon with excitement about the quality of the bite marks in this specific case. He convinced the judge that he was an expert, and Marks was convicted. The prosecutor later told the LA Times, "There is no question, but this case is going to go down as the most significant bite mark case in forensic history." People v. Marks became the foundational case in the field of bite mark analysis, even though it opened by acknowledging no established science of identifying persons from bite marks.
But
so that's good.
The problem here, and you're probably going to go into, is that like this is the fundamental difference between like law and science, is that now this is set as precedent. Now in the legal sense, they're going to be like, okay, well, we've done this one thing, and it seems that, I mean, if what I've watched on TV is correct, again, not a lawyer. If what I've seen is correct, then it's like they're going to use that as precedent later in another case, whereas science is the opposite. You don't go based on precedent. You go based on things that are constantly changing. It's always evolving. They should be progressing. That's right. The problem with COVID, for example, you know, with our knowledge on COVID.
If science was based on precedent, like oncologists would be like, well, yeah, we really think this chemotherapy thing might help. And you're like, well, no, I'm sorry. We established with precedent that we melt people's cancer with fire. You know, like that's what we've been doing for 1,300 years. Yeah. The precedent is clear.
Right. But now it's a precedent, and that's all you need in law, like precedent from 100 years ago about whatever.
Yeah. Anyway, Kaveh, that's the end of part 1. In part 2, we have a lot more things that are going to make you angry. But first, why don't you make the audience know where your pluggables are?
Yes, you can find my podcast, The House of Pod. It is a humor-adjacent medical podcast. We look at the intersections of public health and social justice sometimes and pop culture, and it's fun. And if you like Behind the Bastards, you're probably going to like our show. We're similar, but not as good. So check us out. That's a pretty good sell, right? We're not as good. Check us out anywhere you get podcasts. And if you want to follow me on socials, the Kaveh, look up Kaveh MD or look up The House of Pod.
You know, Kaveh, I've found, this is one of my life hacks that you listeners at home can take. People really like and trust you more when you use self-deprecating humor. So I've started, whenever I meet new people, saying, "Hi, I'm Robert, and just so you know, 3 years ago, I was involved in a hit and run that killed 7 people."
Yeah, that's a great way to break the ice.
It's good. It makes them trust you. Like, oh, you know, this guy's not, you know, all, you know, up on his own bullshit about stuff, right? You know, he makes mistakes just like me. He kills 7 people in a hit and run, you know?
And they're like, "This is a Wendy's, sir. What do you like, I have a hamburger."
All right.
That's all I got.
Part 1's done. Goodbye.
Behind the Bastards is a production of Cool Zone Media. For more from Cool Zone Media, visit our website, coolzonemedia.com, or check us out on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.